Up next is the argument from religious confusion or religious diversity. So, the idea behind this argument is that if God exists and creates finite persons, it seems like we'd expect God to ensure that finite persons would at least know how to properly relate to him. Like, relationship with God, after all, is profoundly valuable, and failing to appropriately relate to God is believed by most theists to have, dire eternal consequences. And so we should therefore strongly expect God to clearly reveal to finite creatures the proper way to relate to him, more generally what God is like, and how we can flourish in communion with him. But here comes the data, right? Crucially, though, God has not clearly revealed this. The world is massively religiously diverse and confusing, containing thousands of religions with competing claims about God's existence and his nature and his character. And they have various competing claims as well about how we are to live our lives and how God wants us to live our lives and, the appropriate ways of relating to God and achieving salvation or things like that. And so, the idea here is that, evidently, if God exists, God seems, shockingly inept at conveying these matters of such dire and eternal significance to humanity, leaving us with, conflicting and non-obvious religions with, pretty, mundane and seemingly silly religious texts depicting God as, drowning babies or, commanding the utter destruction of entire people groups, including, the children, or, sanctioning monstrosities like collective punishment, things like that. So, just the sheer mess of religious diversity, the extent of confusion and strife that this causes, and the kind of lameness of purported divine revelations, they all seem to be a testament, intimately bound up with one another. They seem to be a testament to God's failure to kind of adequately communicate and clearly communicate to us what God is like, how we are to live, and how we are to kind of appropriately relate to God. And so, given that we very strongly expect God to do that, if God exists and God hasn't done that, whereas under naturalism, this is all just these are all just religions are the results of various complex social and cultural and various other factors that vary region by region. So it's not terribly surprising if God doesn't exist that we'd see this vast diversity, the confusion, the strife that it causes, and the lameness of divine revelations. That's not very surprising on atheism. Whereas on theism, it does seem incredibly surprising. And so it seems to be pretty good evidence for atheism over theism. That's the general line of argument.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not so sure about this one. It's would we expect everyone to get it right? It seems like there's a sense in which this is kind of a subset of the divine hiddenness thing. It's well, if you've got a totally wrong idea about who God is and how to worship him, that might just be because of your upbringing. That might be because you haven't sort of been given the relevant evidence or information. But it does seem as though you could point to the fact that though human societies the world over think of God totally differently, almost everywhere we look, there is some kind of religious sensibility, some sense of the sacred and profane, of the numinous, of the supernatural. And so throughout this religious diversity, the fact that despite this diversity, they all sort of converge on this one thing. There's some evidence that there is something going on, because even everyone who disagrees can agree that, the supernatural exists, for example. So you could sort of flip it on its head and say that there's a as long as there's that common thread, this gives us the sort of the diversity of everything else only serves to underline and re-emphasize the agreement,
Suppose a single parent raises children, right? And we come across the children one day. They're alone in their house, and there's just engaging in massive strife. Sometimes they're punching each other. They're there's pretty big strife between them, pretty big conflict. And we sit down with them. It's guys, why are you yelling at each other so much? Why are you being so mean to each other and so on? And it comes out that at least part of the reason is that according to one of them, the single parent said that they get to have the Wii today. They get to play with the Wii today. They alternate days or whatever, so they get the Wii today. But according to the other one, the parent told them that they have the Wii today. And so it's the conflicting claims about what the parent says to them that's engendering this strife. Now we can ask supposing that they're equally genuine and they totally believe that the parent has revealed to them that they're the one who's supposed to have the Wii today. Supposing that they're being honest and reflective and whatnot, and that this is engendering the strife between them, and supposing furthermore that the parent has the opportunity to clarify this matter very easily. They could just walk down the stairs or something and just tell them. We can start forming hypotheses about how how good of a parent this is. Is this a perfectly good parent? And it doesn't seem to be the case that the parent is perfectly good. Given this, the parent easily could have prevented lots of this strife by making it clear which child gets the Wii today. And, you might come around and say, well, they at least agree that there's a parent, It's like, we agree that there's something supernatural. They agree that there's a parent. Like, oh, it's not a very plausible response. It's not, that wouldn't do in the court to try to exonerate
Well, I think
the parent.
if the question was whether this parent existed, let's say it's in a courtroom, does this parent exist? And they brought in these kids and they said, can you tell us about your parent? And one of them went, oh yeah, she said I could have the Wii. And the other one goes, no, that was me. And they start sort of bickering in the courtroom about like who got to play with the Nintendo Wii. I think the judge would like bang his hammer and say, okay, sort out that argument elsewhere. We don't really care. Like we've got what we need, which is like obviously the parent exists, right? And also, you say, the parent could just sort of come down the stairs and reveal himself. People often say, why doesn't God just come down and reveal himself? And the Christian answer to that is, of course, he did, and we killed him. And it's sort of like, okay, at that time, that's kind of what's believed to have happened. It's sort of like it's the grandchildren of the people who are fighting over it, trying to figure out if the parent existed, and the grandchildren sort of can only remember that their grandparents said that they'd saw the parents because the parent is now like dead or whatever. And so it's sort of a long time ago and they're not really sure about the accounts and stuff. I mean, sure, God could like come down every single day and correct us, but then people would say like, how detailed is that going to get? If somebody has a dispute about whether God is a Trinity or not, okay, maybe God should come down and like let us know, with like a big sort of angel with a horn and a big scroll that says, verily I say unto thee. But then what about like minor disputes? What if there's like a debate about, whether it's appropriate to use the female pronoun when referring to God? And it's sort of like, well, is that really worth a whole divine decree? What if they're sort of like debating whether, churches should be tax exempt or something? It's sort of like, well, I don't know if that's quite worth it. So I'm not sure God would come down to settle every dispute. It does seem plausible that the biggest ones are quite important. But then some would say, he did. He gave us a book, and the book is what we need.
Right. So no, I think I think this is a good point. So the argument really, so to your earliest point about how, the judge would say, well, clearly you have a parent, right? So like we should simply say, well, like this is not a challenge to God's existence or something like that. But like, listen, the challenge is not so much to the mere existence of a supernatural being, but to God conceived a certain way, a perfectly loving, perfectly good, just and fair God. So it may very well not be a challenge to the bare existence of something supernatural, but it does seem to be a challenge to God so construed. And indeed, the judge would probably say, this parent is not perfectly clear to their children or something like that, or like the parent is not perfectly efficient and fair or something like that, even though the parent does in fact exist. So that's one thing that I wanted to say in response to that point. I guess the next point that you mentioned was about like major disputes versus minor disputes. And I think this is a pretty important distinction in mounting this argument. I think the proponent of this argument, in order to have any like modicum of plausibility, would have to restrict this to like major points, like whether there is a God, how to appropriately relate to this God, and like what this God wants of us or something like that. But not so much the minor details about like, well, should we like go to church on like Saturday evenings or like Sunday mornings or something. And that's not as important as like whether or not there is such a thing as God. But and I know you mentioned like a lot of religious theists will say, God has indeed revealed this. But the point is not whether or not God has revealed it, but whether or not he has sort of clearly revealed it in such a way that like it reaches people and there's no kind of confusion or like diversity as a result of it. I mean, maybe the parent really did clearly reveal to one of the children that they do indeed get the Wii for the day. But like, given that one of them has incurred some sort of deep misunderstanding, and that affects the relationship between the two children with one another and between the children and the parent has excellent reason to step in and nevertheless clarify this particular point. So, it's not so much that God like hasn't revealed anything, but that he hasn't sort of clearly revealed things and hasn't cleared up confusion and the vast amounts of diversity and the strife that this causes. So, I don't know. I think that there are some responses on behalf of this argument to these objections. And of course, there are other objections. Let me just mention one. Sometimes people argue that it's actually not terribly surprising under theism that we'd see like massive religious confusion and disagreement, since there are various goods that can be secured by religious confusion, like helping one another learn about God, a kind of collective pursuit of truth, right? Dialogue across deep ideological barriers, working together in community, opportunities to love those who deeply and vehemently disagree about matters of such deep importance, and so on. A lot of these there are various opportunities for growth in virtue, growth in knowledge of God, helping one another learn about God, and these seem profoundly valuable. So that's another response that someone might make. Briefly, I do just want to say a few things in response to this response.
Sure.
We're kind of a few layers into the dialectic, but oh well. So one response to this response, and again, I'm not here to like defend this argument. I'm just trying to like give it the best shot that it can in the audience's eyes. While there are indeed a number of goods that result from, massive religious confusion and disagreement, there are also lots of bads that seem to be much worse than those goods, like, religious wars, religious persecution, widespread religious intolerance, dehumanization of those on the opposing side, tribalism, significant epistemic vice. So given this, I don't know, it doesn't seem like the goods mentioned kind of sufficiently justify massive religious confusion, and they don't seem to make it much less surprising on theism. And this is all like this becomes all the worse if there are like dire eternal consequences for getting the wrong religion. That's a common theme throughout a lot of atheological arguments. The arguments actually get more powerful if you think that there are like dire consequences for getting a lot of these things wrong about God. But anyway,
I agree.
And I guess one final thing that I want to mention is that these goods could be arguably these goods could be secured without massive religious confusion, since a lot of these goods, dialoguing with one another across ideological barriers, a lot of these can actually be accommodated within the confines of a single religion with clear and widely accepted dictates about how to properly relate to God and what God is like. So, yeah.
Sure thing. Okay, so then the big question, where does it go? What do you think?
Well, I mean, in my estimation, it's not as powerful as the problem of evil or divine hiddenness.
I agree.
But, as I've been trying to steelman the argument, it does have some plausibility to it. I don't know, like, these parent-child analogies.
The more I talk, the more I'm sort of convincing myself. I'm putting it so eloquently that I'm beginning to. It's sort of bumping up every single time. No, I agree with you. As we talk through it, you're quite right. It is powerful, and like I say, it's kind of a subset of this divine hiddenness kind of thing. Like, I must say that there is like an intuitive, non-propositional force to just thinking like, really, like there's like a whole world of Muslims and a whole world of Christians, and both of them just think that the other has just got it like deathly wrong. And they're just these fully functional countries, societies, religious traditions and histories and theologies and scriptures, and like really, like at least one of them is just like completely doomed. I don't know about it, man.
And I mean, also, just think if things were different. This is another way that we can see the force of the argument. Think if things were different. Think if across causally isolated societies, across thousands of years, people independently converged on like one religion, and they got like, although they may disagree about like whether or not to use he or she or them pronouns or whatever for the being, although they disagree on minor things, they get, generally speaking, the major things of major significance right. Like, that there is a God, generally speaking, what God is like, generally speaking, how we are to appropriately relate to this God, and in general, what God wants of us. Imagine that independently people sort of converge on that. That would be significant evidence, I think, in favor of God's existence, in favor of there being a being who's directing the things like that, directing its creatures like this. But the fact that we don't see that then is evidence against the existence of such a God. And so, I don't know, I think there is some plausibility to it, and it makes me think maybe it should go somewhere around B tier.
Do you know what? I was thinking exactly the same thing. This is going swimmingly so far. We haven't had any major disagreements. B is where I was going to put it.
Okay.
And I am also beginning to worry that maybe subconsciously, when thinking of these arguments, they sort of occurred to you in order of plausibility, and we're just going to sort of make our way down the list.
No,
but you know what? I'll stick it in.
Okay, no, but maybe the
confusion
first
is
three
going
did.
to be to okay, yeah. We'll see in a second. So we've got the problem of evil in S tier, divine hiddenness in the A tier, religious confusion coming in just below it at a B tier,